What if the foundations of Cleveland were never meant to be seen? Not the skyline, not the factories, not the steel and smoke that turned the city into an industrial giant, but the stone beneath it. In 1903, as Cleveland prepared for rapid expansion, excavation crews were ordered to dig deep into the downtown lakefront. The purpose was practical: civic improvements, structural surveys, foundations for a modern city rising into the 20th century. But what they found below did not match the city above. At first, the reports were routine: soil density, bedrock measurements, utility planning, everything consistent with a growing industrial center. Then the language changed. Pre-existing structures, unforeseen depth, more elaborate than projected. Those phrases began appearing in internal documentation, and then they stopped. Why would a routine municipal excavation produce terminology that suggested something already built beneath the city? For the first several weeks, workers expected the usual: abandoned basements, early settlement remnants, forgotten commercial foundations. That was standard for a city evolving quickly. Instead, they encountered walls, not rubble, not debris. Walls. Limestone blocks fitted together with precision that did not resemble frontier construction. Stone surfaces smooth, edges sharp, joints so tight that even in early photographs no mortar lines are visible. If these were simply old basements, why did they look engineered rather than improvised? Cleveland's early architecture was documented: timber frames, brick storefronts, modest masonry, and nothing resembling massive stonework hidden meters below ground. Yet excavation teams reported chambers extending deeper than surveys predicted. And then came the first contradiction: the orientation. Layer after layer of underground structure appeared aligned along identical angles, the same directional bearing, the same geometric consistency. Different decades should not build in perfect alignment with each other. Different builders should not replicate invisible plans buried beneath them. Unless they were building over something they could see, or something they were instructed to follow. Beneath downtown, corridors seemed to mirror each other across vertical layers, walls positioned directly above older walls, passages stacked with unnatural precision. Was it coincidence, or adherence to a design that no longer exists in records? As excavation advanced, another anomaly surfaced. The stonework changed. The deeper they went, the larger the blocks became. Heavier, more refined. Curvature and vaulted ceilings that suggested advanced understanding of load distribution. Early American settlements were not known for classical vault engineering. Yet photographs show arches maintaining perfect curvature despite decades underground. If these were simple storage spaces, why were they built with architectural sophistication exceeding what stood above them? Then watermarks appeared. Lower chambers showed signs of prolonged saturation. Limestone polished smooth in patterns consistent with erosion. Floors bearing patina that develops only after extended contact with standing water. No flood records explain it. No mapped waterways account for those depths being submerged. Why would foundations deep beneath the lakefront appear water-worn without historical flooding at those levels? Engineers reportedly debated whether underground water channels once existed. But no follow-up surveys were preserved. The reports grew shorter, descriptions more vague. Another contradiction emerged in the decorative details. Fragments of columns were documented. Not crude support posts, not rough-cut stone. Columns with fluting, capitals adorned with floral motifs. Bases carved with proportional accuracy, consistent with classical architectural training. Frontier Cleveland had no known population of Greco-Roman stone artisans. So where did those elements originate? Some explanations later suggested salvaged materials from demolished buildings. But that creates another problem. Why were refined decorative elements located in the lowest strata, beneath layers of newer construction? Salvaged materials are reused in upper structures, not buried under them. Unless they were not salvaged. Unless they were original. As more chambers were opened, the size of certain spaces surprised even experienced workers. These were not cramped cellars. They were expansive rooms with balanced proportions, symmetrical geometry, walls meeting ceilings at deliberate angles. If they were commercial storage, why the symmetry? If they were utility spaces, why the ornamentation? And why did some appear sealed intentionally, packed with compacted material as though closed deliberately? When certain sealed rooms were breached, interiors appeared undisturbed, stone intact, surfaces preserved, no signs of collapse. Why seal architecture that shows no structural instability? At this stage, the city was focused on modernization, deadlines, budgets, public image. Yet internal accounts suggest hesitation among engineers. Some passages extended beyond excavation boundaries, not random tunnels, systematic corridors, linear, oriented, connecting chambers as if part of a larger network. If this was a forgotten basement complex, where did it lead? Why did it extend beyond known property lines? And why were deeper passages the first to be refilled? Official reasoning cited safety, geological concerns, structural risk to planned civic buildings. But unstable sections were sometimes left open for documentation, while refined chambers were sealed promptly. If safety were the priority, why preserve unstable cavities and close, architecturally sophisticated ones? Another contradiction surfaced in early photography. Workers standing beside blocks so large the scale becomes difficult to dismiss. The stones appear machine-finished, uniform, angular, consistent. Tool marks, if present, are subtle. What tools in early Cleveland could achieve that precision? Industrial stone cutting was emerging in the late 19th century, but these blocks were buried beneath layers dated earlier. Were they relocated? Or older than assumed? Street-level photographs from the same era reveal something else unsettling. Entire first floors of some downtown buildings appear partially submerged below modern grade. Entrances elevated, windows half buried. Why did so many structures seem constructed at a lower street level than later photographs show? Was the ground level altered? If so, what required such elevation? Urban fill was common in expanding cities, but filling entire districts suggests something significant beneath. And yet documentation for large-scale fill operations during certain periods remains sparse. As excavations continued, pieces from different sites displayed identical design elements, matching moldings, consistent proportions, repeating decorative themes, as though fragments belonged to a unified architectural plan once spanning the district. How does a city accidentally build over a coordinated underground complex? And how does that coordination escape detailed historical record? Soon after these findings intensified, the documentation shifted again. Reports became condensed. References to specific depths removed. Photographs archived separately rather than collectively. Why disperse evidence rather than centralize it? In municipal operations, comprehensive reporting is standard, unless comprehensive reporting becomes inconvenient. Toward the final weeks of excavation in late 1903, the projects were not concluded. They were halted, not completed, halted. Language in internal memos implies abrupt decision-making. Why stop a survey mid-progress during a major civic expansion? The final chambers accessed before closure were described in limited surviving accounts as unusually refined. Stonework so tight that thin blades could not penetrate joints. Platforms capable of supporting multi-story weight. Passages descending further into darkness beyond planned excavation limits. And then, those areas were backfilled. Promptly. Workers reportedly instructed to refill complete rooms that had just been opened. If the goal was understanding the ground for future construction, why erase newly revealed architecture? Municipal budgets do not typically fund excavation, only to undo it immediately. Another contradiction remains in what did not surface publicly. Newspapers of the era enthusiastically covered Cleveland's transformation, the group plan, public buildings, economic growth. Yet little mention exists of unusual underground discoveries during those months. If nothing remarkable was found, silence makes sense. If something remarkable was found, silence makes even more sense. As years passed, official explanations reduced underground findings to earlier commercial basements or misidentified geological formations. But basements rarely feature classical columns. Geology rarely forms symmetrical vaulted chambers, and glacial drift does not carve decorative friezes. One might argue exaggeration. Early photographs can mislead. Perspective distorts. Yet scale comparisons with workers in frame suggest substantial size. Why were no comprehensive follow-up excavations conducted in subsequent decades to clarify? Urban redevelopment projects occurred later. Utilities were expanded. Subways considered. Yet no large-scale reopening of the 1903 depths appears documented. Was there nothing to investigate? Or was it deemed resolved? Another inconsistency lies in alignment with surface architecture. Certain streets appear to trace lines consistent with deeper walls. Did planners unknowingly follow ancient geometry, or did they observe something already there during early development and align accordingly? If early settlers encountered pre-existing stone, would they have documented it or simply built atop it? In frontier environments, practical survival outweighed academic curiosity. Strange foundations might be reused without explanation. But by 1903, Cleveland was no longer frontier. It was organized, industrial, capable of thorough surveying. And yet surveying was curtailed. Consider the water-worn surfaces again. If underground chambers were once submerged, water levels must have differed dramatically. Lake Erie's history includes fluctuations, but not documented levels matching those depths in recent centuries. Could sediment accumulation have altered apparent depth? Possibly. But that invites another question. What event deposits enough material to bury refined architecture across an entire district? Urban fill requires intention. Natural deposition requires catastrophe. Neither scenario appears fully documented for that era. Then there are the vanished photographs. Several referenced in internal logs no longer appear in accessible archives. Lost through time? Misfiled? Or selectively removed? Archival gaps are common. But when gaps coincide with anomalies, suspicion grows. Some surviving images show only partial views of chambers, angles cropped, upper sections visible, lower sections obscured. Was that coincidence of framing or deliberate limitation? One could argue overinterpretation, yet the pattern persists. Refined chambers sealed, documentation condensed, excavation halted, public narrative simplified. Each element individually explainable, together more difficult to dismiss, and still, no definitive statement was ever issued. No announcement of extraordinary discovery, no scholarly investigation widely published. Instead, quiet progression. The city rose, foundations poured, stone and steel ascended above whatever lay beneath. Imagine standing at one of those excavation pits in 1903. Seeing arches that did not belong to your century, touching stone polished beyond necessity, watching supervisors debate in lowered voices. Would you question it? Or trust official explanation? Perhaps the simplest answer is correct. Perhaps they were remnants of ambitious 19th century projects long forgotten. Perhaps decorative elements were relocated debris. Perhaps alignment was coincidence. But coincidence repeated across layers becomes pattern. Pattern repeated without documentation becomes anomaly. Another lingering contradiction lies in structural capacity. Some underground platforms appeared engineered to bear weight exceeding the modest buildings above them at the time of their burial. Why design foundations for grandeur not realized, unless the grandeur once existed and was removed? Removed before official record. There is also the matter of ceiling material. Accounts describe chambers packed densely, almost methodically. Not collapse, not natural infill, but deliberate closure. When cities demolish structures, they clear debris. They do not entomb intact rooms beneath layers of soil without explanation. Unless concealment is preferable to exposure. Was concealment necessary? If so, for what reason? Structural instability? Public confusion? Historical complication? Or something else entirely? By 1904, references to unusual findings fade almost completely from accessible municipal documents. Cleveland's narrative returned to progress and industry. The underground became background, but the few remaining traces suggest that for a brief period, the earth opened enough to reveal something unexpected, something older, or simply something misplaced, and then it was closed again. The unanswered questions remain layered like the strata themselves. Why were the deepest, most refined structures the first sealed? Why did orientation persist across supposed eras? Why do water-worn surfaces contradict recorded flood history? Why do decorative classical elements appear beneath industrial foundations? Why were excavation projects halted rather than completed? Why did documentation shrink as discoveries grew more complex? Each question alone may seem speculative. Together, they form a network as interconnected as the corridors described beneath the lakefront. If those passages still exist below modern Cleveland, they remain silent, hidden beneath traffic and concrete, supporting buildings whose occupants never consider what lies meters below. Perhaps nothing extraordinary, perhaps forgotten infrastructure, or perhaps architecture from a chapter of history no longer acknowledged. The 1903 excavation was framed as preparation for the future, yet it briefly illuminated the past, a past that did not align comfortably with the established timeline. And when timelines fracture, narratives adjust. Whether those adjustments were pragmatic or protective is impossible to state conclusively. But the pattern of concealment, intentional or incidental, leaves space for doubt. Cities evolve, layers accumulate, records disappear, yet stone endures, and somewhere beneath Cleveland's downtown, beneath reinforced concrete and asphalt, beneath steel foundations and modern basements, those lower layers may still remain, aligned, sealed, watermarked, ornate, waiting, not necessarily proof of a lost civilization, not necessarily evidence of deliberate suppression, but undeniably unresolved. If excavation crews in 1903 truly uncovered nothing unusual, why does the language of their earliest reports suggest otherwise? If the chambers were mundane, why close them so quickly? If the findings were harmless, why not publish them proudly as historical curiosity? And if the architecture was simply misunderstood, why has no comprehensive reassessment been conducted since? Perhaps answers exist in archives not yet examined. Perhaps explanations are simpler than they appear. Or perhaps complexity was easier to bury than to confront. The earth opened once. It can open again. But until it does, the questions remain suspended beneath the city. What exactly did they uncover in 1903? Why did they stop digging? And if Cleveland stands upon something older than its founding, something refined and intentional, something aligned and concealed, who built it? And why was it hidden? No official conclusion resolves those contradictions. No definitive record clarifies the deepest layers. Only fragments remain, fragments of stone, Fragments of documentation, fragments of doubt, and beneath them all, the silent foundations of a city that may be resting on more history than it admits.